Hello everyone, this is Daniel. Welcome to another YouTube video. A couple of videos ago, I did a video where I basically solved and talked through in detail solving a bunch of master level puzzles on chess.com. That video was very well received, both on YouTube and on my Twitch stream. People were asking me to do another one of those videos where I walk through my thought process and sort of the mental mechanism that allows me to solve high-level chess problems and chess tactics. And I have responded, so I will do another video where I walk through about 5 or 6 approximately chess puzzles in the rating range of 2,000 to 2,300, so sort of expert to master. And I will talk through every one of those problems and try to explain how I go about solving them, and perhaps, as I usually do, share some tips on tactics improvement and calculation and puzzle solving in general. And without further ado, let's get started. Okay. So we have a position here where it's black to move. We're down a piece. So that's observation number 1. We're down a piece. Observation number 2 is it's an endgame. So clearly something drastic is going to have to happen here in order for us to come back from this. The first move that I see is rook d5 check. This is a move a lot of people would just play without thinking, because after the king takes the pawn, we can take the bishop. And you know, you win the bishop back. But it's very important to resist that initial temptation. The problem is, if you go rook d5, king e6, rook d4, well, let's extend that line for a couple of moves. He takes our rook, we take his rook, and he takes the pawn, and white is actually up 3 pawns. So the second observation, which doesn't seem as relevant, but actually is that white is already up a pawn in this position. He's going to be up 2 more. That doesn't actually help the issue. But if we look a little bit more carefully, notice white's king. It's in the center, but it actually doesn't have all that many escape squares, right? It can't go back to e4. e6 is currently covered by the rook. And really, rook d5 would be checkmate were it not for these 2 squares that the king can escape to. And black has just the piece to guard these escape squares preemptively. And the move king f7 here poses the mate threat rook d5. And there's actually no defense to that threat. Let's unpack that for a second. If he gives us a check on c7, we can actually just block with the rook. And the exchange of rooks doesn't help. Black's still going to be threatening rook d5. By the same token, if after, well, king f6 would be a pretty interesting move. If after king f7, white goes rook c5, then we just go rook d5. And because our rooks are doubled, this is still going to be checkmate. So we go king f7. They go rook c7. It's important to go with this rook, I think. Let's try to figure out why. Yeah, because if we go with the other rook, then he can simply bring his other rook to c1, and this rook is going to be pinned to the king. So we won't be able to move it to d5. And, okay, bishop c5 is a meaningless move. We go rook c5, and the game is over. Very good. Okay, next position. So here we have an interesting situation. The first thing I see is the tension that is going on here, right? There's some diagonal tension. And I noticed that black's bishop is x-raying white's queen. Okay. Now, the other thing I notice, and I've talked about this at length in previous videos, is undefended pieces. You always have to notice undefended pieces, by which I mean pieces that are literally not protected by any other pieces or pawns, because they often factor into a vast majority, I would say, of tactics. At least they play a tangential role in them. And I noticed the rook on c1 here is undefended. So combining these 2 observations, right, the fact that the bishop x-rays the queen and the rook on c1 is undefended, we notice the move rook c8. Not a particularly complex move. Now, it's harder to understand the fallout of rook c8. What threats does rook c8 create? Well, the bishop has 2 defenders and it has 2 attackers. So it's not like we're threatening to just take the bishop twice, but we are threatening 2 things that relate to this rook on c1. First of all, we're threatening b5. b5 attacks the bishop, and if bishop takes on d5, this is after rook c8, then we take on c1 with check. It's very important that that is check. If it wasn't check, the bishop would capture the pawn on e6 and it would actually be a fork against black's queen. So we take the rook with check, and then we recapture white's bishop, and we're just going to be up a rook. So after the move rook c8, white's going to have to do something to either get the king out of check or defend the bishop, or both. And the move that seems to accomplish both is rook f to c2, right? Now if we go b5, that doesn't do anything because of, well, bishop takes his own pawn on d4. Yeah, bishop takes d5. So this is where it's very important to return to the first observation. That might sound a little bit weird, but what often happens when we're looking at tactics is, okay, we notice a move and we try to understand why we played that move. In this case, the rook on c1 is really, I would say, the root reason that we played rook c8, and then we forget about the other thing we noticed, which is the x-ray. You want to keep reminding yourself of all of the tactical features of the position. And if we remind ourselves of the x-ray, then after rook c8, rook c2, what I notice is the move rook takes c4. He has to take with a rook, and then we go pawn to b5. And we are, in effect, pinning his rook now to the queen. If he moves his rook somewhere, we take the queen. If he doesn't, we take the rook with our pawn, and we're going to remain up a piece. If we calculate a little bit further, the only thing I notice in that position, so to recap, rook a c8, rook f c2, rook takes c4, rook takes c4, b5, he can try to move the rook away to c7 with tempo. And that is an unpleasant move because if we take his queen, he takes ours and he's up in exchange. But when there are two queens hanging, and this is a rule that everybody must remember, the first thing you look for are what's called desperado sacrifices. I think most of you are probably familiar with that term. That's where you essentially give up your queen for as much as possible with the knowledge that you're going to take his queen after that. So if you can give the queen up at least for a piece, that's better than just giving it up scot-free, just giving it up for free. The other thing you're looking for is checks, right? If you can move your queen away with a check, you don't even need a desperado sacrifice. The king has to move, and then you take the queen, and you're up a whole queen. Here we do have a desperado sacrifice. We can just take that rook on c7. And once he takes our queen, then we take on b3, and we're up a piece at the end of the day. The only other thing I wanted to point out here is what happens if rook e to c8. If rook e to c8, then if we repeat the whole line, b5, rook c7, and we desperado sacrifice, at the very end of that, the bishop on e7 is actually going to be undefended. So again, undefended pieces play a role for both sides here. We got to go rook a c8, takes, b5, desperado sacrifice. Notice that if he would have taken our bishop and counter desperadoed, we would have taken the rook with check and then taken the queen. So here we take the bishop and the game is over. Okay, so let's see what this problem has in store for us. All right, interesting situation. The material is, well, black is up 2 pawns actually, so we kind of need to do something urgently. What tactical features do I notice here? Well, there is some, there's tension here between the knights. We can take the knight if we want to, and we can win a pawn, but since we're down 2 pawns and our king is a little bit flimsy, that doesn't seem to constitute success. I also notice that black's king is a little bit flimsy. There's something about black's king that's not sitting very well with me, right? The f pawn is gone, and the bishop on d3, there's a potential check on h7. I know that doesn't seem to matter right now. The other thing I notice is that the queen and the rook are in one diagonal. Whenever there is a queen and a rook on the same diagonal, and you even have bishops, that is something you have to notice because the skewer is one of the most powerful tactical motifs that in existence. You can skewer the queen to the rook, and then you can win at the very least in exchange. And again, it's all about combining observations here. We notice the weak king, we notice the queen and the rook on the same diagonal. So after knight takes c6, d takes c6, one thing that really appeals to me is the move bishop to d6. And this creates an elementary kind of x-ray. Well, the reason queen takes d6 is not possible is because of that rudimentary x-ray idea. We move the bishop away, discover check against the queen, and then we take the queen. We have a queen for 2 pieces. If he doesn't take the bishop and he moves his queen away, then we take the rook. And not only have we won an exchange, after the queen recaptures or the king recaptures, it walks right into the frying pan, another x-ray, and so we can pick off the knight then with the move g5. So you might be asking, well, how did I how did I know to combine these 2 observations? Well, that's where my animal brain came in. I mean, I just combined them subconsciously, but at the same time, you can sort of try manually to ask yourself, okay, well, I see the queen and the rook on the same diagonal. Can I try to skewer the queen and the rook? How can I do that? And if you ask yourself that, you'll notice the move bishop d6. Maybe you'll think that move is impossible at first, but as I indicated in past videos, you never want to reject a potentially powerful move immediately. You always want to give it a chance. So let's execute these moves. Okay, knight e4. So that's not a move I anticipated. I think it makes a whole lot of noise, but these moves can be a little bit annoying. So there's two possible... Okay, so bishop takes c7 is the trick, right? They take on d2 with check, and we can't take the knight. We actually have to take the knight. And the problem is solved. Whoa. Now this looks crazy, but these problems can actually be the easiest ones, the ones that look the craziest, and I think this is no exception. What is the first thing I see? Well, black is down a piece, right? 2 bishops against 1 knight. And white has these massive pawns. So we clearly are going after white's king. There's no doubt about that. Checks, captures, threats is the sort of elementary advice that is shared. And part of the reason that I sometimes am skeptical about this advice is because it's one thing to just say, look for checks, captures, and threats, but I would modify this and say, look for every check, capture, and threat, not those that look logical, but literally every single one if you are going to apply that principle. Because what happens is your brain sort of self-selects, and it assumes subconsciously that certain moves are not good, and that's not good because then you defeat the whole purpose of using this method. So the other thing we can notice is this a2 pawn. If the bishop were gone from a1, well, then a1 queen would not only promote, but it would promote with checkmate. So the move queen takes a1 check comes to mind because it's both a capture and a check. King takes a1, and now we can smoke the king out of there with rook e1 check. If the rook blocks, we take with discover check, and it's checkmate in like 50 different ways, so the king has to move away from that. Boy, is that a lot of arrows on those squares, and as if that was enough, we promote a1, and the hilarious thing is we can actually make a bishop there, and that will still be checkmate. Such is the power of this idea. Boom, boom. Okay, queen d1, very effective defensive resource, which is refuted by rook takes d1, and the game is over. Very nice. Okay, let's proceed. Whoa, wait a second, what is going on here? Isn't the rook hanging? Literally, the rook is hanging with check. Black is also, but let's not forget to make the observations. Black is down a piece, so I think this could be a case of move first, think later. I mean, I don't see why not take the rook. Yeah, okay, so king f2, this is where we actually really need to think. Sometimes chess.com does that, and I like it. You know, sometimes you have to know to call your opponent's bluff and not to overcomplicate things. Now, this seems like actually a pretty complicated problem, so prepare to sort of hunker down and get to the bottom of it. Now, what does white have now in return for the exchange? We have a rook for a piece. Well, I mean, white has this beautiful knight on t6. The king on e7 is weak. The knight on h5 is clearly very misplaced. There's a lot of things that are going for white. What's going for black, in addition for the exchange, is the fact that white's king is also, it seems to me, quite weak, right? It's on f2, and the other thing that's going for us is the fact that the queen is x-raying the rook, and it's important here, notice my wording, it's not the rook is x-raying the queen is x-raying the rook, because the rook is undefended. Again, those darned undefended pieces coming to the rescue, but of course the rook is also x-raying the queen, because if the bishop comes out, yes, white might sacrifice the rook, but there might be problems in relation to black's king that require greater attention than the rook on h1. So even though it's hanging, white can use that as a ploy to orchestrate an attack against the king. The other thing to notice here is the rook is hanging. So I've said a whole lot of stuff here, and what I'm really leading to is I don't think this is anything extraordinary. I think this is one of those problems where you just have to find a simple move. And I think the simple move is just to take on a3. We take on a3, we prepare something like rook a2, rook takes c2, and I don't see any good square for the bishop. I mean, bishop can go out to p5. We take the rook. He takes our bishop. I mean, that could be actually pretty unpleasant. He takes our bishop with check, and then if we take with the rook, queen takes d7 check. And I forgot to mention at the beginning of the video that you're welcome to follow along with a real board. In fact, I highly recommend it if you feel like you're having trouble visualizing some of these longer lines, so there's nothing wrong with that at all. Okay, so this is actually kind of an annoying, well, it is an annoying problem, and it's also an annoying idea. Rook takes a3, bishop b5. So what this is telling me is either I need to calculate that line more deeply or I'm missing something pretty simple here. So let me think here for a second about what it could be. And like I always do, and I always say, there's nothing wrong just sitting in silence for 5-10 minutes if you have to, and just hunkering down and trying to get to the bottom of a position. That's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take as much time as I need, think about it, and share my thoughts with you once I have them. So here we go. Okay. And by the way, I will just say as I'm thinking that I do think this is a problem where they didn't fully anticipate the difficulty, probably because I'm overthinking it, and they did not intend. Probably the move is just rook takes a3 and the problem stops there. But I'm not solving this to impress anybody and say how many I got right in a row. I'm solving this because I want to learn and I want to get better at tactics. So I think that should always be the mentality, not I want to solve this as quickly as possible, but rather I want to figure out and get to the bottom of this position, even if I know that the problem is going to end after, a certain move. Okay. This is a doozy. Let's move bishop b5. It's a nasty, nasty resource. I have one idea here. That's an alternative. And if this is the move, then there is no way this is a master level problem. But no, it's definitely not the move. The move was queen b2. But maybe queen a1. Yeah, but then he goes g4. This gets so complicated. All right, I'm just going to go here. Yep. And they go bishop b5. So I have an idea here. I think that you have to take the rook. Because if you don't take the rook, what else can we do? Let's use the process of elimination. Well, if we go queen b2, he takes on c8. I don't see an upside to that. If we go queen b4, he takes on c8. Oh, maybe queen b4. No. We got to take. Okay, now I think we have to go king f8. If we take on c8, he takes on d7, and he goes around. Okay, queen takes d7. Okay, and I thought about this, and what I think it is... let's break this down and look at his threats. Queen e8 is one of his threats. So I think it's king g8. That's what what occurred to me is the move king g8. Just trying to escape to h7. This is a hard move to see from a distance. But it is king g8, and we just escape. Bishop d3. I calculated all this, and now I thought the key move is rook d3. This is actually what I missed when I looked at this initially. I thought that black had to play g6. And maybe it is g6. I'm not ruling that out because now I see it's a little bit more complicated. But there's the move bishop takes g6. It's a very nasty move. And after f takes g6, he has the discovery. So we're going to take it. Now we're going to go g6. And finally, the problem is solved. It's listed at 2207. That was really hard. But I'm very happy that I sort of forced myself to think it through. I learned a lot. What we learn here is that you can't ignore any pieces. Every single piece is important. Even the rook on a3, it looks insignificant. What happened is that my brain had filtered it out. My brain had it grayed out the rook, and I forgot that it existed. And it actually was crucial to the correct solution of this puzzle. Now let's do one more, and then we'll wrap up there. Here it is white to play, and clearly, well, white is again down a piece, but he's got a very big attack against black's king. So... clear compensation here. There's no doubt about that. The question, how do we go about, finishing the attack? Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind using the checks, captures, threats formula. One is the queen h5 check. The other is knight takes f5. Queen h5 check, I'm quickly starting to rule out because it actually helps black, right? King f8, the king kind of inches closer to its defensive cocoon. I don't see a purpose of that. Knight takes f5 seems completely overwhelming because... you're removing the defense from the knight on e4. I mean, this just looks crushing. And now just queen f5. Yeah, so this is a very simple problem. It's all about realizing that there isn't anything extraordinary here. It's simply a healthy, solid attacking move. Problem solved. Okay, well, that was very hard, and I loved those problems. We had a full variety. We had checkmates. We had attacks. We had subtle defensive moves. We had long lines. And hopefully you enjoyed this once again. As you can see, it's not automatic for me. None of these problems are automatic. I have to think them through just like you do. And some of them involve long calculations. So a lot of you will need practice just learning how to visualize lines, and I'll do videos later on where I show that. But for now, I think we'll wrap up for this batch of problems. I will definitely do more of these at different levels. I'll do sort of a grandmaster problem video where I might do, only 2 or 3. And I might do one at a somewhat lower level, 16, 1800. So I'll do various tiers of this. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do like my content, consider liking or subscribing. I greatly appreciate everybody's support, and I will see you soon once again in a new video. Goodbye.